Thank you very much. So today you've been talking about success, and I'm going to be completely the fly in the ointment because I'm not going to argue for success at all because I can't really be doing with it. I'm going to be arguing for failure instead. As one of the many failures that I have done, is I have massively over-prepared for this talk because I think I got a little bit overexcited. Failure is a topic that I've been researching for years and years, and I keep on thinking, okay, I'm just done with it. I don't want to deal with this anymore. But then as soon as I start, I get incredibly enthusiastic. So my plan is that I'm going to try and talk for about 40 minutes. I have my alarm on to stop. And it might be a little bit truncated, my talk, because I suspect I could talk for, I don't know, an hour and a half non-stop, and I think you all might want to go home at some point. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to, as I talk, there's going to be a film behind me. And this film is very much operating as a visual soundtrack. I'm going to talk about a number of different artists' works, but I'm generally quite reluctant to, when I'm talking abstractly, not to use images of artists' work as an illustration, because I think it tends to kind of really get in the way of thinking about that artist's work. That might be something you agree with, and it might be something you don't agree with. I'm also very aware that you're going to be completely distracted by what's on the screen. That's very much part of the reason why I'm showing it. I think it's impossible to keep one's attention on one thing. And it's really that oscillation between positions that I think is fundamental to our topic today of what is success. So I think we always need to think about, if I'm going to propose failure to you as something that's productive, we need to think about what does it mean to fail. Now the answer must always be tuned to the key of its context. Failure is personal and political, it's local, it's global, it's present, it's past, and it's future. You have failed is a judgment that really cuts to the quick. It makes your heart sink, it makes your stomach go to your feet, and you feel terrible. Yet, if failure is released from success, and success is failure's tired and over-familiar travelling companion, I think failure can become incredibly productive. It can also become oppositional, and it can become capable of contesting and rupturing expectations. And I know that most of you in this room, although not all, are artists. There's other people who are academics or working as curators. All of these three fields, you've got to embrace failure. Otherwise, what are you going to do? You're simply going to represent something that, if you're an artist, that looks like art, smells like art, tastes like art. Well, you know what? If you're doing that, nothing is really changing. And really that's at the heart of my argument for failure, is there's so much at stake in art that we have to be bold enough to fail. But failure isn't just about art. Uncertainty and stability, I would say without doubt, characterise contemporary times, but also they perhaps characterise historical times and future times. Nonetheless, success and progress seem to endure as a condition to strive for, even though none of us have any faith in either of them. All individuals and all systems know failure better than we might care to admit. Failed romance, failed careers, failed politics, failed society, failed targets, failed humanity, and failed failures. Failure is too often tied up with its twin of achievement. And this is a codependent relationship that is fed by distinction, fear, and opportunity. Perhaps a more accurate pairing with failure might in fact be utopia. Now, utopia is an abused and misused term, certainly in the realm of art. It's a trope that haunts discussions of art, certainly from the first decade of this millennium. To speak of utopia, I believe, is in the very same breath to invoke failure. Whether located in rhetoric or enacted in heterotopias, Utopias are entirely subjective ideals. Reality will always fail the idealisms of utopian desires, which in any case are always built on particularity and subjectivities. Utopias are only useful in their very failure. So there's one artist who I want to cite, who's an example of an artist who very usefully turns to utopic thinking, and that's the American artist Josiah Michelini. For Josiah Michelini, it could be a conversation between the sculptor Isamu Noguchi and Buckminster Fuller, debating the feasibility of reflectiveness in sculpture in a reflective space. Or it could be attempts to model the Big Bang. Or it could be the novelist Paul Scheerbart's discussions of ironic utopia. These subjects fuel Michelini's practice. He creates highly crafted environments and makes makeshift stagings that looks as if it could have been pulled together in less than half an hour, to create screens onto which idealized visions of the future can be projected. So failure and the future, failure in the present, failure in the past, this temporal dimension of failure, and with that success, are always really important to try and negotiate. Michelini's artwork is formed from detours and collisions in the history of ideas. His works claim skill, beauty, and wonder. He makes coloured glass vessels that curvaceously hold their ground, mirrors that infinitely repeat design objects, reflections that distort to make abstract yet more abstract. He makes chandeliers that glisten at ground level. In 2003, he made a sculpture that I think is a really incredible work, and it's titled Buckminster Fuller's Proposal to Noguchi for a New Abstraction of Total Reflection. Now, this work made material an idea that purportedly was developed between the architect and the sculptor in a conversation that is said to have taken place in 1929 in a Greenwich Village pub called Romany Marie's. Now, as is often the case, Michelini took a very little known event in the history of ideas, somehow grabbing something from the past and throwing it into the present to make understanding awkward. So the visionary architect and artist, an assistant to Brancusi, who worked on the sculptor's high shine surfaces, discussed the possibilities of an invisible sculpture whose reflected forms would be presented in a totally reflective environment. This would be impossible. It would fail. Yet the exercise in talking it through was incredibly productive. And then a number of decades later, in 2003, Michelini's sculpture is a realization of this notion, 74 years after a conversation that we believe to be true, because we're told so within art history books. A machine-made mirrored glass plinth supports a range of mirrored, hand-blown glass objects, reflecting both themselves and their echo through light and not through shadow. So this is a work that is presenting live and direct. It's a tautological object that holds and produces time. It repeats what exists like a real-time camera feed, filling the visual field with distortions. So failure and representation when it comes to art. All of the artists in this room will certainly know that frustration when you have to document your work and you just cannot document it. I always think that a really useful guide is something fantastic that Gordon Matta Clark once said. He said, and I'm now going completely off my notes, so I'm paraphrasing. He said that throughout all of his artistic practice, he never wanted to make a single shot artwork. And by that he meant an artwork that could just be captured by photography. Now, he was talking in the 1970s, and obviously technology has massively changed since then. But if you can represent an artwork in an image perfectly, surely the artwork doesn't have to exist. Surely for art to have something at stake, and this is something I'm going to keep on coming back to this afternoon, to have something at stake, that direct encounter is so important. So the not working can sometimes point to something that is working. There's another artist who I wanted to mention, who we're showing at the Henry Moore Institute right now, who I would also like to claim is absolutely about failure. The artist Ian Kerr. And Ian Kerr also, like Josiah Makelele, turns to the writer Paul Scherbart, as well as writings on architecture by Frederick Kiesler, Aldo Rossi, Bruno Taut. And there's one series of works that he's made that I think are really grappling with issues of failure in an artistic and in a much wider societal realm. He made a body of work that's really skirting around a novel written in 1850 titled The Black Tulip by the French writer Alexandre Dumas. And it's a really fantastic book, and because it's completely out of copyright, you can just download it from the internet really, really easily. And it's a brilliant book, and it recounts the careful, competitive cultivation of a black tulip. And this black tulip is a screen onto which power, jealousy, political might, and desires are projected in a tale of value and naming. So the book is set in Holland in 1672, and it invokes the time of tulip mania. And this was a period some 4 decades before the book was actually set, when a tulip bulb could be worth more than a house and was deemed as close as one could get to divinity on earth. So because of this value system in the black tulip, speculation and belief in future value inflated a market that spectacularly crashed. Now what Ian Kerr does is he mines stories such as this. He mines experiments in literature, architecture and philosophy. And what he makes are fragmentary, fragile models that call on gravity, material, scale and encounter. Repurposing debris, repurposing the left behind to create props and proposals for perceiving objects and ideas in space. So Ian Kerr uses discarded and humble materials. It could be some perspex found in a skip in an artist studio complex. It could be a chocolate wrapper. It could be standard size paper. What he's interested in doing is in creating an atmosphere of engagement. His works slip between description. They operate as objects, models, sculptures, works, projects, environments. But in each instance, they are a continuous study of value and form. So value and form. These are terms, these are currencies when we start to talk about success and failure. So these two artists that I cited, what they do is they create models that explore how projections for the future are activated through outcomes and activity that inevitably lead off the expected path into new realms of productive knowledge. I would say that describing either of their work as utopian is to lose the incisive charge of failure, inviting in its place nostalgia, a wish for what might have been. Nostalgia is something that I think is deeply dangerous. Like utopia, paradoxes are at the heart of all dealings with failure. It is a position to take, yet one that cannot be strived for. It can be investigated, yet it's too vague to be defined. Even if one sets out to fail, the possibility of success is never eradicated, and failure immediately is ushered in. Through failure, one can potentially stumble on the unexpected. Mobilizing failure is a strategy utilized in the practices of business, politics, and entrepreneurship. Failure can be commodified, valued for its distinctiveness, but at the same time, more interestingly, failure can resist market forces. Failure is easily romanticized and used as an excuse, simply because failure is easier to recognise than success. Yet when harnessed, failure can bring radical changes. To embrace failure, especially in the realm of the production of knowledge, which I would say making art is, academic research, and making exhibitions of. To embrace failure is to perform an act of bravery. We live in a failed world, a failure of so many things. Failure of the left, failure of sustainability, failure of humanity. Eric Hobsbawm, the rather marvellous Marxist historian, writing just before the turn of this century, admonished that, quote, "If humanity is to have a recognisable future, it cannot be by prolonging the past or the present. If we try to build the third millennium on that basis, we shall fail. And that price of failure, that is to say, the alternative to a changed society, is darkness." So failure is useful, but one needs to be wary of romanticising it. In a world where it seems that there is nothing that can be done, I think sometimes a non-dogmatic glimmer of hope, informed by failure rather than success, can offer a position for possibility. Now, we all know that in the realm of art, failure has currency and potential for criticality that embraces possibility. Without the doubt that failure ushers in, any situation becomes closed and in danger of being dogmatic. Art making can be characterised as an activity where doubt lies in wait at every turn, and where failure is not always unacceptable conduct. In actively engaging with failure, artistic practices have the ability to propose a resistant view of the world, where doubt is embraced, experimentation encouraged, and risk considered a viable position. To celebrate failure is to identify moments of thought that eschew consensus, and that's really important for art. Art is not about cementing what already exists, it's about moving things somewhere else. One of the most crucial places where we can identify the endemic presence of failure in the art-making activity is in the inevitable gap between intention and realisation. So I'm not an artist, I never have been, but I would certainly like to claim that all of you who are artists many, many times have intended to make something, and what you've made is nothing like it at all. That's exactly how it should be. Because if you make exactly what you're thinking of, exactly what you could describe in, I don't know, heaven forbid, a funding proposal or something like that, then what are you doing? There's no point in making the work. It's not intellectual work. And intellectual work is one of these terrible phrases that I'm sure there's many reasons why one shouldn't use it, but I love it. And I think that we have to claim art as being intellectual work, because it's trying to add something to the world. I think that the condition of art making places failure central to engagements with the complexities of artistic practice and to the ways in which art resonates with the surrounding world. So, if failure is endemic to the creative act, it opens the question not if something is a failure, rather how that failure is harnessed. Failure can open a wormhole through which one can travel to the past. If a recollection is represented as a perfect point-by-point double of the past, it is time travel without knowledge of the present. And the philosopher Paul Ricoeur writes so beautifully on how important it is to forget. And if you forget parts of memory, you have a much more productive experience. A memory of the past that has been tainted by the imagination is a process predicated on engagement. So the past becomes filtered through the knowledge of the present. Now, the danger of bringing the past into the present is to mine failure, potentially inducing nostalgia. So failure, we've got to be really careful not to get too excited about failure. it can all too easily become a wistful memory of what might have been. And I think the best example of this is the really fabulous play that I've never seen, I've only ever read, by Ionesco, called The Chairs from 1952, where a couple, now in their later years, are depicted constantly talking about their failed plans, what might have been, what could have been. And there's a kind of warm, like a nice warm bath, a warm nostalgia to what could have been, rather than what is and what was and what will be. This absurdist play is a warning to such a nostalgic comfort that failure can bring. So bringing the past into the present through the power of nostalgia can be productive. And throughout my talk, I'm going to be constantly being annoyingly tautological. And I think that's the nature of failure. So one example where I think an artist is using nostalgia in a useful way is the American artist Carol Bove, who accumulates references and objects, for example, lifestyle commodities and gestures from the past that have suddenly become highly attractive in the present. She uses references that range from Playboy to Marshall McLuhan to Jane Fonda, via design classics, the exhibition designs of Carlos Scarpa, and the sculpture garden of New York's MoMA. Carol Bove's compositions turn these symbols of utopian desire that have failed but somehow have a currency in the present as ways of referring to outmoded ideological positions. Translated to the present, such symbols of change act as reminders that if somehow things had played out as planned in the past, a very different future might have been delivered. Bove's assemblages, though, are not melancholic, rather they propose possibilities. As Gertrude Stein noted in For in America, quote, "A real failure does not need an excuse. It is an end in itself." So to strive to fail is to go against socially accepted drives towards ever better success. Failure, when divorced from a defeatist, disappointed or unsuccessful position, can be shifted from being simply judgmental. So consider, for example, the work of Fishley and Weiss. If you think about their amazing film that I'm sure everyone has seen, and if you haven't, you must see it. Their film, The Way Things Go, from 1985. It's a film where systems of objects tumble like dominoes. It's almost as if they're trained objects that use wheels, fire, and ramps to perform their roles. However, close inspection, so if you watch it repeatedly for maybe 5 or 6 times, you'll immediately see that within it there's one cut. And this one cut was when the circus fails. And Fishley notes, quote, "For us, when we were making the piece, it was funnier when it failed, when it didn't work. When it worked, that was more about satisfaction," end of quote. Perfection equals completion. Failure maintains openness. And I think it's this opening that failure does that can really help us somehow ward off dogma. So rather than being a space of mediocrity, failure is required in order to keep a system open and to raise questions rather than simply providing rhetorical answers. Just like failure, though, the mediocre can be put to use. The French artist Robert Filliou celebrated mediocrity. Indeed, he reacted to the dismissal in mainstream culture of artworks that radically changed definitions of art as simply indicating that, quote, "modern art is the revolution of the mediocre," end of quote. And I think that's rather wonderful. So he's saying that if there's some kind of shock and scandal saying, is this really art? Is this nonsense, what we now call art? If it's mediocre, Filliou is arguing that that really is quite exciting. In 1965, Robert Filliou founded, with George Brecht, a shop called Le Sadi qui Sourit in Villefranche-sur-Mer on the French Riviera. It was the international headquarters of the Centre of Permanent Creation. Activities of the Centre of Permanent Creation were guided by the maximum, quote, "Whatever you do, do something else," end of quote. And they were realised by encouraging friends to visit and misunderstand each other. Filliou applied his principle of equivalence in full force. Now, this principle of equivalence is a classification system that measures all products of human labour by the categories well-made, badly made, or not made. Each distinction being an equally important legitimate outcome of the creative act, embracing the potential of failure and error by removing value judgments of good and bad. I think we all need to watch ourselves, and I do this. I think no one is without guilt. We need to watch ourselves from saying, that artwork is good, that artwork is bad. What does that mean? Absolutely nothing. Filliou was really trying to release these judgments that are meaningless. The definition of good versus bad and failure versus success are slippery and are contingent on the critical apparatus one uses to define value. So you need to know what that critical apparatus is. And these measures are inextricably bound up with assumptions that we use to try and understand our place in the world. And these assumptions are socialised subjectivities that are often unconscious and applied without thinking. Filliou's concept of permanent creation stipulated that everybody is a genius and that everything a person does is of equal value. He took ideas of pleasure, exchange, cooperation and conviviality over expertise, authority or talent. For Filliou, talent is merely the ability to acquire skills to execute a task efficiently. He asked what might happen when failure is taken as a productive activity. In his retail outlet, it was only open if the two proprietors were visited at their homes. However, neither Filliou or Brecht would usually be found at home. Usually, they would be sitting in a cafe nearby, busily adopting the artistic cliché of the cafe genius. Filliou noted, quote, "No one admires the cafe genius. They influence no one. This is great. This is success, for we must get rid of the idea of admiration and the dead weight of and the dead weight of leadership." So, persisting with an activity in spite of its inherent failure is a task suffused with optimism. And the film, Steamboat Bill Jr. from 1928, that's playing behind me, or beside me I should say, is absolutely about persisting with a task in spite of its failure. This is an optimistic film. In 1953, Samuel Beckett completed a trilogy of novels with the monologue The Unnameable. Narrated by a disembodied voice, the text wrestles with the limits of language and the impossibility of reconciling thought and its expression. So maybe this is one of the greatest human failings that in fact makes us human, the impossibility of reconciling thought and expression. His closing lines of The Unnameable announce, "You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on." Samuel Beckett, of course, embraced failure. In 1949, the journal Transition published 3 dialogues, a text where Beckett ostensibly discusses with the art critic and historian Georges Dutoit the painterly practices of Pierre Talcote, one of the founders of Tattrism, André Masson, whose engagement with surrealism and automatic painting have rippled through art history, and Bram van Velde, an abstract painter Beckett engaged with persistently. Although published as a conversation, with notes on the participants variously exiting in tears and reminiscing warmly, the text was primarily written by Beckett. Many Beckett scholars regard this text, Three Dialogues, as the closest the writer ever came to a statement of his own position. Emphatically stating that failure is the inevitable outcome of artistic behaviour, Beckett argues that engaging with failure offers a possibility for art to refuse expression. A quality he proposes is a misperception at the core of the reception of art. So a misperception that art should express something. He asserts that to counter this erroneous assumption, the artist must announce that there is nothing to express, nothing with which to express, nothing from which to express, no power to express, no desire to express, together with no obligation to express. And he continues that to be an artist is to fail as no other dare fail. This submission, this admission, this fidelity to failure is a new occasion, a new term of relation. For Beckett, failure is to fail to represent. By engaging with and exposing the myths, impossibilities and resistances of representation, an attitude mindful of the fails inherent in the very operations of attempting to show experience can be constructed by using observation and experiment to demand and engage participation in thought and in action. Amplification of failure can lead to something. As Dieter Roth describes, smearing and destroying are the result to achieve what I want. That's why it became a method in my work. I realised that even Malevich's black square resulted from a feeling of failure. One always arrives at something one can no longer depict. And we can also look to Giacometti, who describes that he believed himself only capable of producing a pale image of what he could see with his own eyes, leaving him to believe that any success he might have would always be less than my failure, or perhaps equal to that failure. So setting out to succeed to fail and fail to fail steps aside from the orthodox order in order to enter instead into a realm of doubt and not knowing, in a refusal to give or take authority. So failure and authority are really knotted together. Rather like Filiu's Café Genius, to embrace failure is to turn away from ambition and to seek no place in history, making instead an indifferent and critical claim on the present. So rather than being a lazy default position, indifference can offer a position of resistance, as exemplified by Herman Melville's Scribe in his short story of 1853, Bartleby the Scrivener. It's a wonderful short story in which the narrator, an elderly lawyer, describes his encounter with Bartleby, a man who he chose to employ in his chambers on the basis of his apparent constancy to even out the inconsistencies of his existing employees, one of whom was irascible in the morning and the other in the afternoon. So Bartleby was super fast and committed at his chores at the start of his employment. But the Scrivener very quickly adopted a pointed conduct of indifference, responding to questions with the simple phrase, "I would prefer not to," in an incessant passive resistance to required and prescribed behaviours. To take such a position is to be beyond redemption. I really like to be beyond redemption. And the thinkers Leo Bassani and Ulysses Dutoit state in their introduction to a really fantastic book, The Arts of Impoverishment, that surely nothing can be more dangerous for an artist or for a critic to be obsessed with failure. Dangerous because the obsession we're speaking of is not the coming anxiety about failing, but rather an anxiety about not failing. And they make their argument through the work of Beckett, of course, through the painter Mark Rothko, and also through the recently late filmmaker Alan Resnick. So Bassani and Dutoit continue and say, they ask, what happens when an artist, quote, discourages an audience from coming to their work and says, I have very little, perhaps nothing to say to you. I have very little, perhaps nothing to show you. To put it this way, my work is without authority. You will learn nothing from it. It will not even engage your life with that delight or superior pleasure which you've been led to believe artists have the obligation to provide you. So the reason why I think this book is so important, especially for artists to read, is that Bassani and Dutoit really argue that art is not about educating, entertaining, or redeeming. So if you want to be educated, going to look at art isn't the best way to do it. You might be much better to study philosophy, for example, to take another degree, to do a doctorate. If you want entertainment, well, you'll probably have a lot more fun if you go to, I don't know, a fun fair than going to an exhibition. If you want to be saved, there's plenty agencies that will try and save you. Art does something else. It does something more important than that. What happens when art is divorced from a redemptive position? When it really cannot save, educate, or entertain? What's left? I think that art released from the assumption of edifying value offers a subversive possibility to resist cultural authority and open productive forms of engagement. Bassani and Dutoit suggest that such a break can occur when an artwork refuses truth, defies description, and becomes, paradoxically, concerned with failing and not failing. To try something out with the potential of failure hovering above demands a set of observations and close attentions in order to assess whether failure has been arrived at. Such an effort raises awareness of hierarchies and structures that might otherwise go unnoticed. See the case of Bartleby the Scrivener. Testing is a different register when considered a process rather than a search for progress. When testing is an end in itself, non-completion, and therefore non-perfection, becomes an option. There is pleasure through testing, through failure. So you could look at artists such as Chris Burden, Dominique Gonzalez-Forster, Annika Strom, Roman Signer, or the two artists who I mentioned earlier, Josiah Mekaleni and Ian Kerr. To speak of failure is to direct a relationship with the modernist project, with the idea of the inventor, be it the artist, the scientist, philosopher, or explorer, is embedded in the search for a radical break in the world that will be ushered in by narratives of progress within the sphere of knowledge. When one's expectations are dashed, there can be an opportunity for a new register of thinking. One can, to quote Robert Smithson, investigates one's incapabilities as well as one's capabilities, in order to open questions of how structures and limits shape the world. The philosopher of science Karl Popper's experimental process falsibility takes the stance that truth, or rightness, can only be found when there is no possibility of refuting a statement. Popper's is a process based on sustained speculation, which starts with a repeatedly tested hypothesis, rather like Buster Keaton does here. He describes creative thinking as capable of breaking through the limits of the range. To apply critical thinking requires more than working with assumptions at hand. One must engage with failure and embrace the unanticipated. When we learn any skill, subject, or action, we have to try things out to see if we can establish a way for things to work. This enables discrepancies between what is and what might be, to be found. With this comes the ability to push understanding beyond the limits of the horizon. To test is to seek to refute. Just think of Felia's revolution of mediocrity, or even of the Salon des Refus, where the artworks judged failures were the very ones that have built art history. To cite Beckett, ever trialed, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. So to try again is to repeat, to enter into a series of rehearsals with no end point or conclusions. To achieve resolution is to achieve a masterpiece. A masterpiece is a work where nothing can be improved, nothing added. Beckett's advice is to keep on trying, even if the hope of success is dashed again and again by failure. John Baldassari's celebration of wrong imagery asks, for example, what does it matter if a tree sprouts out of a head? To do so is to turn away from the authority of what is deemed is to be right. Baldassari states, art comes out of failure. You have to try things out. You can't sit around terrified of being incorrect, saying I won't do anything until I do a masterpiece. And I think there's a really amazing novel that I've just skipped a section of because I need to close soon, by Balzac, called The Unfinished Masterpiece. It's a brilliant discussion of the ways in which failure at one point becomes success at another point, and about that constant frustration of an artist trying to do something and trying to do something, constantly not being able to achieve what one wants. What I want to close is by saying that between the two subjective poles of success and failure must lie a space of potentially productive operations, where paradox rules and where transgressive activities can refuse dogma and surety. It is here that failure can be celebrated. Failure operates in the production, reception, and distribution of artworks, which inscribe certain practices into the history of art. The history of art is constantly tested and challenged, and that very history itself is involved with the artist operating as an active agent, seeking ruptures and spaces within contemporary experience in order to place something at stake within the realm of art. The purpose of art is not to represent or to illustrate what already exists. There's an urgency to art. There must be something at stake at art. For there to be something at stake with art, there must be a possibility of failure. So I haven't been here for the previous sessions, unfortunately, because I had to be somewhere else. But I think that success is overrated. Don't follow it. It's not worth it. Failure is something that can open up new possibilities, new routes, and most importantly, it can change the way we understand our place in the world. And that is the responsibility of art. So I'm going to close now with talking at you, and then maybe we can take some time to talk together, which is more enjoyable. So thank you. Well, thoughts are more interesting than questions, because I probably won't be able to answer them at all. And we can maybe put the lights on. If you want to see this film, it's so easy to see it. I think you can download it from numerous illegal websites. This is proper, but it's always worthwhile seeing. Good. It's essential.
well, actually, successive overrating. Successive overrating all the time, you can understand the overrating as well. And I think
I really, really agree. And it's something, really about this. I think it's something that it's something that curators and people who run organisations really have to think about. I think that when one presents art in an exhibition, it is an institution's responsibility to engage with people completely correctly. I really, really believe in that. So it's an opportunity to enter into a dialogue. It's the moment when art is released from the studio into the unpredictable realm of the public. I think that it's very important that art organisations do not go down the route of trying to say to their audiences, you can understand this. Because if you can understand this, whatever this might be, it's about placing something within language. It's about expecting resolution. If art is pushing beyond the limits of a horizon, if art really is making a difference in the world, it needs to exceed language in some way. And the moment when we can't just describe something, when language fails us, you've got to think a little bit more. Not understanding something, we all deal with it. Probably everyone often is in that situation where you think, oh, you know what, I really want to know about a new subject. I'm really interested in, I don't know, a particular philosophical line of thinking, or even learning a new language, or even knowing something about natural history, for example. You look at it and you think, this is not my subject, where do I begin? And the first book you read, you don't understand a word of it. But what you do is you've got to jump in somewhere. And I think when it comes to art making, when it comes to presenting art in exhibitions, you have to say to people, just jump in. And I feel really, really strongly that art has to be difficult. If it wasn't difficult, people wouldn't study it. Governments wouldn't spend millions on it. There wouldn't be organisations all around the world dedicated to art. And what we have to say to people who are coming in to look at art, whether they're specialists or non-specialists, is to say, yes, you might not understand this. Art is really, really hard, and that's why it's so brilliant. And not understanding is when you have to start thinking and trying to work something out. So that moment when you're reading a book, or maybe you don't have this, I just have this, and you just can't understand it, you have to read the same sentence again and again and again. Sometimes it takes years to get past that first paragraph. But what you're doing is you're thinking and you're wrestling with something. And I think failure to understand means you've got to persist with it in some way. And it's how we learn. It's how we learn when we learn to walk. It's how we learn when we try to make things. And that is through those slips that you can make a difference. Mm-hmm. There was a question at the front, the lady in stripes. Yeah. Yeah. Completely, and that's the whole tautology of it. So Beckett is the kind of arch person who everyone refers to when they talk about failure, and it's him who says to be an artist is to strive to fail like no other. And of course, striving, it's the sense of doing something to test something out. I agree is more accurate, because if you strive to fail, well, what are you going to get? You're just going to get exactly what you want? And does that take you anywhere? Perhaps it's a better way of saying it is to not be afraid of failing. And sometimes that moment when you're not afraid is when you can find that you can actually do things.
Sorry, am I on? Or sorry. Okay. It's very interesting your entire talk. I think things might begin to change, and the reason I say that is because I mentioned before that I have a science background as well. If you had to think of the opposite in most people's sort of experience to art, one would say science, and yet what they both share is the importance of failure.
Absolutely.
And what also underpins this, I think, is two things. One, the role of teachers at every level in society to open their lesson with, this is a place you can fail in. And too late you get university students coming along who have gone through the mill, and they look terrified when you say that to them. Because they feel they've got to get their first-class honours degree, which may or may not be of any use anyway, nowadays. So what I was going to say is that what underpins this is this urge to, it's just an observation, I agree with so much what you have to say, but the thing I think that it underpins is the need to play, not for any end product, but just to play for play's sake. And that is on the increase. One of the other things I do is I'm one of the trustee members of Playworks. You know, we're going to be seeing, I think, vis-a-vis Gove, this
That's
urge to... sorry.
Sorry, that's my alarm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll shut up in a minute.
No, please,
just
carry on.
Okay, the bell sounded. I was just going to say that one of the things that is happening is that there's this reaction against this kind of top-down dictate that everyone's got to succeed. What for, since there's unemployment? So people now might be willing to look towards experiencing things for their own sake.
Mm-mm.
And I think there's a great movement amongst younger parents, certainly, to actually try and regain the purity of play, which allows people to fail, because there is no end product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
No,
that's it.
that's great. Thank you very much. Gentleman there's a gentleman in the front.
Thank you very much. I was going to say that I think failure is something that you should embrace. Certainly something that I've always embraced from the moment I set out to be an artist. I can't understand how you could possibly achieve anything. I mean, I come from Nottingham. All my school friends went down coal mine. That was what you didn't do if you weren't, if you didn't want to fail at anything. That's you did what society wanted. But going on and doing other things is about accepting that perhaps 9 times out of 10 you are going to fail. But I've learned probably the most from the things I've failed the most at. And it's arguable to myself that those are the things that have, as you said, opened doors to new possibilities I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I remember a long time ago, I was working with the Jim Henson Company, and Jim Henson was my mentor then. And
Wow, fantastic!
oh,
I'm deeply jealous.
it's time to. Anyway, so at the time they were in a transition period because they finished a couple of films, Labyrinth, and The Muppets was no longer, and Sesame Street was a bit of a memory. So they were moving forward, and Jim Henson's son, was a very good friend of mine. We worked together a lot. And I said, we were talking about new projects and new ideas and new things to do. And I said, well, I think this is quite a good idea, in quite a naive way. And Brian said to me, yeah, but it's very risky, and my father can't be seen to fail. And the minute I heard that, you somehow thought it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's all.
No, it's a really good anecdote to tell, because I think the moments that he says, well, we just can't fail. I mean, what happens if a fantastic organisation like Nottingham Contemporary says, well, what if we did fail? Does it really matter? And what does failure matter? And if you think about when it comes to arts organisations, sometimes there's a number of arts organisations that burn really brightly for a decade, sometimes even less than that, but they really made an impact. And they failed, maybe they went bankrupt, maybe the people who worked there moved on to somewhere else, all different kinds of things. It's that temporal element that's really, really important. And I can't believe that The Muppets wasn't made without full failure being courted from top to bottom. And maybe it's a warning for ourselves. And if you think about art-wise, we can all think about examples. I won't cite one because inevitably I'll get myself into trouble. If you think about examples of artists whose work you really, really love, but you find yourself muttering to your friends, you know what, they made great work, but in 1982, it all shifted. They lost the plot. It stopped being really, really interesting work, and one glorifies a particular moment. Sometimes it's because that refusal to think that one might fail comes in, and then there's some artists who just persistently keep on testing things out. I mean, I think one artist actually is Richard Deacon. His exhibition Tate Britain at the moment is a real moment of revealing how he's constantly testing things and thinking through. But one has to constantly not settle into a comfort zone. And it's nice to settle into a comfort zone. And sometimes the greatest censor on the right to fail is ourselves. And that the moment when an artist, even a relationship with a human being, is most exciting is sometimes when nothing might work. It might be a little bit of a failure. Completely. And it's exciting and exhilarating. That's it. Inventive and curious. And curiosity can only be driven by going down blind alleys and trying things out.
Sometimes happy accidents, which are initially regarded as failures, as pointed out, in science there are implications for discovery of little accidents which are initially failures, and then they become something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think with happy accidents and blind alleys and the mention of the Muppets, which I was not expecting this evening, I think we should draw that to a close and thank Lisa again very much for coming this evening and taking us through failure.
And thank you for your questions.